How does a 20-year-old king defeat the greatest empire on earth without losing a single battle? How does the ruler of a small kingdom conquer lands stretching from Greece to the frontiers of India in little more than a decade? More than 2,000 years later, military academies still study his campaigns, historians still debate his ambition, and the world still remembers his name. But Alexander the Great was not born a legend. He became one. This is the complete story of the man who conquered the world. Long before Alexander conquered the world, he grew up watching another man reshape it. His father, King Philip II of Macedon. When Philip took the throne, Macedon was a fragile kingdom surrounded by enemies. By the time Alexander reached adulthood, it had become the most powerful military force in Greece. But Philip gave his son more than an empire. He gave him ambition. Alexander's mother, Olympias, filled his childhood with stories of heroes and gods, while the philosopher Aristotle taught him science, politics, medicine, and the poems of Homer.
Achilles.
Among all those stories, one became an obsession: Achilles. Alexander didn't just admire the legendary warrior. He wanted to surpass him. Even as a boy, his confidence seemed limitless. According to ancient tradition, he became famous after taming a wild horse no one else could ride. Its name was Bucephalus. It would carry him across much of the known world. At 18, Alexander proved himself in battle for the first time. Fighting beside his father at Chaeronea, he helped shatter the armies of Athens and Thebes, securing Macedonian dominance over Greece. The prince had become a warrior. But destiny arrived sooner than anyone expected. In 336 BC, Philip II was assassinated. At just 20 years old, Alexander inherited a kingdom surrounded by enemies and an unfinished dream. Most believed his reign would be short. Instead, it was only the beginning. Because before the young king could conquer Persia, he first had to prove that he could even hold on to his own throne.
Within weeks of becoming king, Alexander moved with astonishing speed. He crushed rebellions in the north before they could unite. Then he marched south. When the Greek city of Thebes rebelled against Macedonian rule, Alexander responded without hesitation. The city fell. Its destruction sent a message that echoed across Greece. The age of rebellion was over. For the first time, the entire Greek world stood behind a single king. Now, Alexander could finally pursue the dream his father had never lived to achieve. In the spring of 334 BC, he crossed the Hellespont with an army of nearly 40,000 men. Standing on the shores of Asia, he is said to have thrown his spear into the ground, claiming the continent as his by right of conquest. Ahead of him stood the Persian Empire, the largest and wealthiest empire on earth. Most believed the campaign would end quickly, not with victory, but with Alexander's defeat. His first test came at the Granicus River. Against experienced Persian commanders, Alexander led the attack himself. The battle was fierce. At one point, he came within moments of being killed, before one of his closest companions cut down the Persian noble who had raised his sword against the young king. Granicus ended in victory. It was the first crack in an empire that had dominated the ancient world for more than 2 centuries. But Alexander refused to slow down. City after city opened its gates. Others resisted. None would resist longer than Tyre. Built upon an island fortress surrounded by the sea, it seemed impossible to capture. Instead of sailing around it, Alexander did the unthinkable. He ordered his engineers to build a massive causeway across the water. After 7 months of relentless siege, Tyre fell. It was no longer just courage that defined Alexander. it was determination. Every impossible obstacle became a problem waiting to be solved. His victories carried him south into Egypt, where he was welcomed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. There, he founded a new city that would bear his name, Alexandria. It would become one of the greatest centers of knowledge in the ancient world. But Egypt was never his final destination. Far to the east, King Darius III was gathering the full strength of the Persian Empire. The greatest battle of Alexander's life was still ahead. Civilizations fall, but history lives on. Subscribe to History Unsealed so you don't miss our next great documentary. And if you're enjoying the journey, leave a like to help us bring history back to life.
Now, Alexander was no longer invading Persia. He was marching toward the man who ruled it. In 331 BC, on the vast plains near the village of Gaugamela, two kings prepared to decide the fate of the ancient world. Darius III commanded an army that vastly outnumbered the Macedonians. He had chosen the battlefield carefully. The ground had been leveled to give his chariots every possible advantage. Everything favored Persia. Everything, except the man leading the smaller army. As dawn broke, Alexander studied the battlefield. Rather than charging straight ahead, he began moving his army sideways. The unexpected maneuver forced the Persian line to stretch wider and wider, opening the gap he had been waiting for. Then, he struck. Leading the companion cavalry at full speed, Alexander drove directly toward Darius himself. The attack shattered the Persian center. Seeing the enemy king racing toward him, Darius lost his nerve. For the second time, the great king fled the battlefield. His army soon followed. With a single victory, the Persian Empire had effectively collapsed. Babylon opened its gates without resistance. Susa surrendered its immense treasures. And at Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian kings, Alexander entered the palace of the empire that had once threatened to destroy Greece. Months later, much of the royal palace was consumed by fire. Ancient historians disagree on exactly why. Some claimed it was an act of revenge for the Persian burning of Athens generations earlier. Others believed it was a drunken mistake. The truth remains one of history's enduring mysteries. But Alexander's ambition had already grown beyond revenge. He no longer wished to rule only as king of Macedon. He intended to become ruler of all Asia. The farther east he marched, the more the world seemed to expand before him. Across the mountains of Bactria and the deserts of Central Asia, resistance became fierce. The battles were no longer fought against great imperial armies, but against swift guerrilla warriors who knew every valley and every mountain pass. To strengthen his hold over these distant lands, Alexander married Roxana, a noblewoman from Bactria. It was more than a marriage. It was a symbol of the world he hoped to build, a world where Macedonians and Persians would rule together. Many of his own officers admired the vision. Others quietly began to question it. Yet Alexander pressed onward. Beyond the towering Hindu Kush, beyond every map his soldiers had ever known, lay India. And there, the greatest challenge of his journey was still waiting. In 326 BC, on the banks of the Hydaspes River, Alexander faced King Porus. Unlike any enemy he had encountered before, Porus brought towering war elephants onto the battlefield. For many Macedonian soldiers, it was the first time they had ever seen such creatures. Despite heavy rain, difficult terrain, and a determined opponent, Alexander adapted once again. After a hard-fought battle, Porus was defeated. But when the captured king was brought before Alexander, he was asked a simple question. "How should I treat you?" Porus answered, "Treat me as a king." Impressed by his courage,
Alexander restored his kingdom and made him an ally rather than a prisoner. It was another reminder that Alexander admired strength, even in his enemies. But while Alexander remained eager to march farther east, his army no longer shared his ambition. For more than 8 years, they had crossed deserts, climbed mountains, fought countless battles, and traveled thousands of kilometers from home. When they reached the Hyphasis River, the soldiers refused to go any farther. For the first time in his career, Alexander could not lead his men forward. Reluctantly, he gave the order to turn back. The conquest of the East had reached its limit. The journey home, however, would prove even more deadly. Determined to explore new routes, Alexander led part of his army across the Gedrosian Desert. The scorching heat, lack of water, and unforgiving landscape claimed thousands of lives. It became one of the greatest hardships of the entire expedition. When the survivors finally reached Babylon, Alexander was no longer simply the king of Macedon, nor merely the conqueror of Persia. He ruled an empire unlike anything the world had ever seen, stretching from Greece to Egypt to the frontiers of India. But building an empire was far more difficult than conquering one. Alexander dreamed of uniting Macedonians and Persians as one people. He encouraged intermarriage between his officers and Persian nobles. He adopted elements of Persian royal ceremony, and he envisioned a new empire where cultures blended instead of replacing one another. Some embraced the idea, many did not. Tensions quietly grew around him. Yet Alexander was already planning new expeditions. Arabia would likely be next, perhaps even farther. He never had the chance. In June of 323 BC, while in Babylon, Alexander fell gravely ill. Days later, at just 32 years old, the man who had never lost a battle was gone.
Because while Alexander's body lay in Babylon, his greatest conquest was only beginning. Within months of his death, the empire he had built began to fracture. His generals fought one another for power. Kingdoms rose where a single empire had once stood. The political unity Alexander had created did not survive him. But something far greater did. Everywhere his armies had marched, Greek language spread. New cities flourished. Trade connected distant civilizations. Ideas traveled farther than any army ever could. From Egypt to Central Asia, Greek philosophy met Eastern wisdom. Science advanced through shared knowledge. Art, architecture, mathematics, and medicine entered a new age. Historians would later call it the Hellenistic World. Its influence would endure for centuries. Alexander founded more than 20 cities during his campaigns. None became more famous than Alexandria in Egypt. Its great library would preserve and expand human knowledge for generations, becoming one of the greatest intellectual centers of the ancient world. And although Alexander never returned to Macedon, his vision had transformed civilizations far beyond Greece itself. Even Rome, the empire that would one day dominate the Mediterranean, would admire Alexander's achievements. Julius Caesar reportedly stood before a statue of Alexander and reflected on how little he himself had accomplished at the same age. Napoleon studied his campaigns. Military academies still analyze his battles. Historians continue to debate his ambition. Was he a liberator or a conqueror? A visionary or a man consumed by endless glory? Perhaps he was all of those things. Ancient Greece gave the world philosophers. Persia built one of history's greatest empires. But Alexander connected civilizations that had rarely understood one another. His empire disappeared, but his ideas did not. More than 2,000 years later, the greatest victory of Alexander the Great is not found in the lands he conquered. It is found in the cultures he connected, the cities he founded,
and the history he changed forever. Thank you for watching History Unsealed, and this was the complete history of Alexander the Great.